Night City never slept. It bled light into the sky like an open wound, every tower and billboard screaming for attention in a world where silence meant you were already forgotten. Down in the lower districts, where the neon barely reached and the gangs carved territory with bullets and bad deals, V was running a job that should have been routine. A corporate data fortress buried 3 layers deep inside the Arasaka subnet. The kind of target that netrunners dreamed about in Flatline trying to reach. But V was not the kind of mercenary who turned down dangerous work. Dangerous work was the only kind that paid enough to matter. So V jacked in, slid through layers of black ice and countermeasures, and pushed deeper into the architecture than anyone was supposed to go. That was when something answered back. It was not a security protocol. It was not a demon or a corporate kill switch. It was something older and stranger, a signal buried so deep inside the net that it predated every firewall built to contain it. A rogue artificial intelligence, dormant for years, suddenly woke when V tripped a forgotten tripwire in the data stream. And when it woke, it did not attack. It pulled. The surge hit V like a freight train made of pure information. Every implant in V's body screamed at once. The neural interface overloaded. The optics flared white. The world around V became static, and then the static became nothing at all. Night City vanished. The towers, the noise, the advertisements, the crowds, the gunfire in distant alleyways, all of it disappeared as though someone had pulled the plug on reality itself. V fell through a void that had no color and no shape, tumbling through the space between worlds like a signal that had lost its destination. When V finally opened their eyes, the neon was gone. There were no towers, no data streams. No hum of a million machines keeping civilization running on borrowed time. Instead, there was silence. A deep, ancient silence that felt heavier than anything V had ever experienced in the loudest corners of Night City. V was lying on cracked asphalt in the middle of a road that stretched in both directions through a town that looked like it had been dead for years. Abandoned cars sat with their doors hanging open, some with dark stains across the seats. Storefronts had been smashed in and looted long ago. Paper and debris drifted across the road in a wind that carried the faint smell of rot and something worse underneath it. V tried to access the local network. Tried to ping any satellite. Nothing. Tried to pull up a map, a frequency, even a basic radio signal. There was nothing there. The net did not exist in this place. It was as if the entire digital world had simply never been built. V stood slowly, checking systems one by one. Optics were functional but running on internal reserves. The reflex boosters were online but showed a power warning V had never seen before. The monowire was coiled and ready, but its charge indicator was already declining. Every piece of technology wired into V's body was operational, but without an external power source, every piece of it was also dying. Then V heard the sound. A low, wet, dragging noise coming from the far end of the street. A figure stumbled out from behind an overturned truck. It moved raw, not like someone injured, not like someone on drugs or lost in cyberpsychosis. It moved like something that had forgotten how a body was supposed to work but kept trying anyway. Its skin was gray and peeling. One arm hung at an angle that meant the shoulder had been dislocated long ago and never reset. Its jaw moved in a constant chewing motion even though there was nothing in its mouth. V's first instinct was to scan it. The optics pulled up a reading that made no sense. No neural activity. No heartbeat. Core temperature far below what any living human could sustain. By every metric the implants could measure, this thing was dead. But it was still walking. Still dragging itself forward with a hunger that had no mind behind it. V put 2 rounds through its chest. The thing stumbled but did not stop. V put 1 through its head. It dropped. And in that moment, standing in the silence of a world with no signal and no explanation, V understood something terrible. This was not Night City anymore. This was not any city V had ever known. And the rules that had kept V alive for years no longer applied here. V adapted the way every good mercenary adapts. Quickly, violently, and without wasting time on questions that could wait until the immediate threat was handled. The town was crawling with them. Dozens of those shambling gray figures emerging from buildings, from wrecked vehicles, from open fields beyond the town limits. They moved slowly, but they moved constantly, drawn to sound and motion like moths to a dying flame. V's Kiroshi optics became the most valuable tool in the new world within minutes. Thermal scanning picked up the cold signatures of walkers at distance, separating them from the ambient environment and marking them as targets long before they could close the gap. V moved through the streets like a ghost, picking lanes and angles with the precision of someone who had spent years navigating the kill zones of Night City's worst neighborhoods. The reflex boosters turned every encounter into a one-sided execution. Where a normal human might panic at 3 walkers emerging from a doorway, V's enhanced nervous system processed the threat in a fraction of a second and responded with a speed that made the dead look frozen in place. The monowire extended from V's wrist and cut through decayed flesh and brittle bone as though they were made of wet paper. In close quarters, it was the perfect weapon, silent, efficient, and requiring no ammunition that this world could not replace. For the first 2 days, V cleared the town block by block. Patient. Every walker that fell was one less threat in a perimeter that V was slowly and deliberately securing. The firearms worked beautifully at range, but ammunition was finite, and every gunshot attracted more of them from the surrounding countryside. V learned that lesson fast and shifted to quieter methods. The monowire. A heavy blade pulled from a hardware store. Stealth and timing over firepower and noise. To anyone watching from a distance, and someone was always watching in a world like this, V must have looked like something out of a fever dream. A figure moving with inhuman speed and precision, cutting down the dead without hesitation or fear. Eyes glowing faintly in the low light as optics cycled through scanning modes. In a world that had been reduced to sticks and stones and desperate prayers, V looked like a machine wearing human skin. But the machine had a problem. On the 3rd morning, V woke to a warning that flashed across the optic display in a color V had rarely seen before. Critical power advisory. The reflex boosters had dropped to 60% efficiency. The monowire's charge was holding but declining steadily with every use. The optics themselves, the single most important system keeping V alive in this world, projected a battery life that would run out in weeks, not months. Night City had charging stations on every corner. Implant clinics that could swap power cells in 15 minutes. A power grid that fed the chrome of millions of augmented citizens without anyone ever thinking about it. This world had none of that. No power grid. No charging infrastructure. No synthetic compounds or microfabrication labs that could manufacture replacement cells. The technology inside V's body was the most advanced hardware on the face of this Earth, and it was all slowly dying because the Earth it stood on had never evolved to support it. V sat on the hood of an abandoned car and stared at the empty sky for a long time. In Night City, the answer to every problem was more tech. Better implants, faster processors, stronger chrome. But this world did not reward chrome. This world rewarded something older and simpler. The ability to endure without it. To find water. To build fire. To sleep with one eye open and wake up ready to fight with nothing but muscle and bone and the stubborn refusal to die. V had never had to consider what survival meant without the chrome. In Night City, the chrome was survival. But here, with every system slowly ticking down toward zero, V was going to have to learn something that no ripperdoc in Haywood or Japantown had ever taught. How to be human again. And that, in a world full of things that had forgotten how to die, might just be the hardest fight V had ever faced. V found them on the 5th day. Or more accurately, they found V. A gunshot cracked from a rooftop 2 blocks east of the town center, followed by the heavy thud of a walker dropping face first into the pavement. V tracked the sound instantly, optics zooming to a cluster of figures positioned behind a makeshift barricade on the roof of what had once been a grocery store. 3 of them were armed with rifles that looked older than anything V had ever seen outside of a museum. One held a crossbow. Another gripped a machete so worn the blade had lost most of its edge. They watched V approach with the kind of fear that only people who have been betrayed by strangers understand. Weapons stayed raised, eyes stayed hard. Nobody spoke first because in this world the first person to speak was usually the first person to reveal a weakness. V stopped at the base of the building and looked up. No threats on the scanner. No hostility indicators. Just 5 terrified human beings trying to decide if the stranger standing below them was salvation or another form of death they had not yet encountered. It was a woman named Elena who finally spoke. She asked V what happened to V's eyes, why they caught the light the way they did. V explained, keeping it simple, that they were implants. Technology from a place very far away. Elena stared for a long time and then told V to come inside. The camp was built from desperation and ingenuity in equal measure. Walls reinforced with car doors and sheet metal. A rainwater collection system made from plastic tarps and guttering. A fire pit that was only lit after dark and only when the wind was blowing the smoke away from known walker migration paths. These people had turned survival into a science, not with processors and algorithms, but with instinct and pain and the hard lessons that came from watching others die. They told V everything. How the world ended not with a war or a bomb, but with a sickness that turned the dead into something that would not stop moving. How governments fell in weeks. How cities became graveyards. How the living scattered into small groups that trusted no one and fought over canned food and clean water like dogs over scraps. V listened and for the first time felt something unfamiliar. In Night City, survival was a transaction. You worked for fixers. You completed jobs. You got paid. You upgraded your chrome and you took harder jobs. There was no community, no shared suffering. No one sat around a fire at night and talked about what they had lost, because in Night City everyone had already lost everything and learned to stop caring about it. But these people cared. They cared about each other with a ferocity that V had never witnessed in the most dangerous districts of the city. When one of them was sick, the others gave up their own rations. When a child in the group had nightmares, someone always stayed awake to sit beside them. They had nothing. No technology. No augmentation. No corporate safety net. And yet they held together with something V could not quantify or scan or download. V began helping them. It started as a practical arrangement. V cleared the walkers that gathered near the camp's perimeter each night, using the monowire sparingly and relying more on bladed weapons to conserve power. V showed them better sight lines for their rooftop watch positions. V reinforced weak points in their barricade using materials scavenged from nearby buildings. But somewhere between the tactical improvements and the silent meals shared around the fire, something shifted inside V. The mercenary logic that had driven every decision in Night City began to soften, not disappear. V was still a killer and a survivor and a person shaped by violence. But for the first time, V was surviving alongside people instead of in spite of them. These people had no chrome. No reflex boosters. No optical implant. They had calloused hands and tired eyes and hearts that somehow still found room for hope in a world that had given them every reason to abandon it. And V, the most technologically advanced being on the planet, was beginning to understand that maybe these survivors knew something about strength that Night City had never figured out. It was Elena who first mentioned the Reapers. She said the name quietly, the way people in Night City whispered about certain Arasaka black sites, not because speaking louder would attract danger, but because the fear itself had become so deeply embedded that the voice lowered on instinct. The Reapers were a raider faction that had consolidated power in the region within the first year of the collapse. While most survivors huddled in basements and fought over scraps, a man who called himself Harlan gathered the most violent and the most willing and offered them a simple deal. Follow him and eat. Refuse him and starve. In a world where food was currency and fear was government, Harlan built himself a kingdom on both. They operated out of a fortified compound 15 miles north, a repurposed industrial complex surrounded by walls made of shipping containers stacked 3 high. Inside they stockpiled weapons, fuel, food, and human labor. Survivors who were captured were given a choice that was not really a choice. Work for the Reapers or be left outside the walls with nothing, which in this world meant death within hours. Elena's group had lost people to them. Scavenging parties that went out and never came back. A young man named Daniel who had gone looking for medicine for his daughter and was dragged into a Reaper patrol vehicle while his screams echoed across the empty highway. They never saw him again. The group survived by staying small and staying invisible, but Elena knew it was only a matter of time before the Reapers expanded their territory and found them. V listened to all of this with the cold calculation of someone who had dismantled gang operations for a living. The Reapers were organized, but they were not corporate military. They were opportunists, dangerous because of numbers and brutality rather than strategy and discipline. V had faced worse in the combat zones of Pacifica and the fortified compounds of Militech contractors. The difference here was that V would be operating with depleting resources in a world with no backup and no extraction plan. V left the camp alone on a moonless night and moved north. The optics, still functional but burning through reserves with every scan, painted the darkness in shades of green and blue thermal overlay. V moved through the dead landscape like a predator that this world had never seen, covering ground at a pace that would have exhausted any unaugmented human within the first hour. The reflex boosters were set to standby, conserving power until the moment they would be needed. V reached the compound perimeter before dawn. The Reapers had set up watch positions at each corner of the shipping container walls, manned by sentries with hunting rifles and improvised spotlights powered by car batteries. V counted the rotation patterns, marked the blind spots, logged every entry and exit point that the optics could identify. Then V went inside. The monowire dispatched the first sentry without a sound. The body slumped against the container wall and slid to the ground while V was already moving to the next position. Inside the compound, V saw exactly what Elena had described. Rows of makeshift shelters where captured survivors were kept under armed guard. A central building where Harlan and his lieutenants lived in relative comfort, eating well while the people outside their walls starved. Weapons racks and ammunition stores that represented more firepower than any single group in the region should have been able to accumulate. V cataloged everything. Positions, numbers, weapon types, structural weaknesses in the perimeter, supply lines, patrol timing. The mercenary mind that Night City had sharpened into a razor worked through the data with the same efficiency it had once used to plan heists against corporate towers. But there was something else working alongside the tactical calculation now. Something that made V pause at the sight of a young girl carrying water under armed escort, her eyes hollow with the kind of exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. In Night City, V would have completed the reconnaissance and sold the intelligence to the highest bidder. That was how the game worked. Information was product. Empathy was liability. But V was not in Night City anymore, and the rules of that broken city felt very far away, standing in the darkness of a compound where human beings were being treated like livestock. V slipped back out the way V had come in, leaving nothing behind but one dead sentry that would not be discovered until the morning shift change. By the time the Reapers realized someone had been inside their walls, V was already back at the camp, sitting across from Elena, explaining in calm and measured detail exactly how they were going to tear that compound apart. And for the first time since arriving in this dead world, V felt something that the Chrome had never provided. Not power, not speed, not the cold efficiency of a system running at optimal capacity. The assault began 3 hours before dawn on a night when the wind carried the smell of rain from the west, and the walkers in the surrounding fields had drifted south, following some instinct that no one alive could explain. V had planned the operation the way a netrunner plans a deep dive, every variable accounted for, every contingency mapped, every second of the timeline locked into place with the precision that only a mind enhanced by Militech-grade processing implants could achieve. Elena's group was not a fighting force. They were survivors. People who had learned to shoot out of necessity rather than training. But V had spent 2 days turning them into something functional. Not soldiers. That would take months they did not have. But a coordinated unit that could follow instructions, hold positions, and trust that the plan would work even when everything around them was falling apart. The first phase was distraction. 2 of Elena's people drove a truck loaded with scrap metal into the eastern perimeter of the compound at speed, the noise and impact drawing every sentry on that side of the wall toward the breach. Gunfire erupted immediately as Reapers poured toward the disturbance, expecting a direct assault. They found an empty truck and the lingering echo of an engine that had been rigged to keep running after the drivers bailed out 300 meters back. While the eastern wall burned with wasted ammunition and shouted orders, V went in through the west. The monowire sang in the darkness. The first 2 guards at the western entry point dropped before either of them could process what was happening. V moved through the compound with a fluidity that belonged to a different era of warfare, a speed and precision so far beyond what this world could produce that the Reapers who caught glimpses of V in the chaos would later describe a ghost, a shadow that moved faster than eyes could follow and killed without making a sound. The reflex boosters were running at full capacity now, and V could feel the power, cells burning through their remaining charge like a countdown that had no pause button. Every enhanced movement, every accelerated reaction, every split-second calculation that kept V one step ahead of bullets and blades was costing energy that this world could never replace. V had estimated 40 minutes of peak performance before the systems began degrading. The compound needed to fall in 30. V reached the central building where Harlan and his lieutenants had barricaded themselves the moment the alarm sounded. The door was reinforced, but reinforced by the standards of a world that had never encountered a monowire filament capable of cutting through military-grade alloys. V carved through the hinges in 2 strokes and stepped inside. Harlan was exactly the kind of man V had expected. Big, confident, surrounded by armed loyalists who believed that strength and cruelty were the same thing. He looked at V with the expression of someone who had never encountered a problem that violence could not solve and was trying to decide how much violence this particular problem required. The fight was short and it was not close. Harlan's lieutenants opened fire and V was already somewhere else, reflexes pushing the body through angles and trajectories that unaugmented humans could not track. The monowire took 2 of them down in a single sweeping arc. A third fell to a pistol round placed with surgical accuracy through the gap between a makeshift chest plate and a shoulder guard. Harlan himself lasted longer than his people, not because he was more skilled, but because he was more desperate. Swinging a heavy machete with the wild energy of a man who understood that losing this fight meant losing everything he had built on the suffering of others. V ended it with a single precise strike that disarmed him and put him on the ground. Not a killing blow. V could have killed him easily. In Night City, V would have killed him without hesitation because that was how you closed a contract and collected payment. But this was not Night City, and there was no contract, and the people imprisoned in this compound deserved to decide for themselves what justice looked like in their world. Elena's group swept in through the breached perimeter and began freeing the captives. The Reapers who had not fled or fallen surrendered when they saw their leader on the ground and their walls broken open. The compound that had been a symbol of terror for months was dismantled in a single night by a handful of survivors led by someone who should not have existed in their world. But V barely heard the cheering. The optics were flickering now. The reflex boosters had dropped below 20% and were entering emergency conservation mode. The monowire retracted and the wrist housing displayed a charge level so low that one more deployment might be the last. V sat down against a concrete wall inside the compound and watched the power indicators across every system trend steadily downward. The chrome was dying, not dramatically, not all at once, but with the quiet inevitability of a fire burning through its last fuel, each system dimming a little more with every passing hour. V had won the battle, but the war between advanced technology and a world that could not sustain it was a war that technology was always going to lose. And somewhere in the exhaustion and the fading glow of implants that would never be recharged, V began to understand that the most important fight was not the one that had just ended. It was the one that was about to begin. The fight to survive is something more than the sum of failing machinery. The fight to be human in a world where humanity was the only currency that still held value. The days after the raid were quiet in a way that V had never experienced. Not the silence of a dead network or an empty street, but the gentle noise of people rebuilding. Hammers on wood, children laughing for the first time in months. Conversations held at normal volume because for the first time in a long time, the survivors did not need to whisper. The compound was stripped for parts and materials. Shipping containers were repositioned to form the walls of a new settlement, one built not on fear and enslavement but on shared labor and mutual protection. The freed captives joined Elena's group, and what had been a desperate band of a dozen survivors became a community of nearly 60 people with skills and knowledge that covered everything from farming to field medicine to mechanical repair. V helped them build, not with cybernetics because the cybernetics were fading faster every day, but with knowledge. V understood structural engineering from years of navigating Night City's architecture. V understood defensive positioning from a lifetime of combat contracts. V understood logistics and supply management from working with fixers who ran operations across entire city districts. The Chrome was failing, but the mind behind it still functioned, and it turned out that a mind trained to survive in one of the most dangerous cities ever built was remarkably useful when applied to building something instead of destroying it. The optics went first. One morning V woke up and the heads-up display that had been a constant companion since the first implant surgery was simply gone. No thermal overlay, no threat indicators, no targeting assistance. Just the naked world seen through eyes that still carried Kiroshi hardware but could no longer power it. V stood outside the settlement walls and looked at the sunrise without digital enhancement for the first time in years. It was blurry and imperfect and more beautiful than any high-resolution scan had ever been. The reflex boosters followed a week later, dropping to a level so low that they no longer provided any meaningful advantage over baseline human reaction time. The monowire retracted into its housing and stayed there, inert, a weapon from a future that this world would never reach. One by one, the systems that had defined V as a mercenary and a survivor in Night City went dark, and V was left standing in the same skin as everyone else. It should have felt like dying. In Night City, losing your Chrome was a death sentence. It meant you were slow and vulnerable and visible to every predator in a city that ran on predation. But here, surrounded by people who had never known Chrome and had survived anyway, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like arriving somewhere for the first time. Elena taught V how to track animals by footprint and broken branches. An older man named Marcus showed V how to purify water using sand and charcoal and patience. A teenager named Sophia demonstrated how to start a fire in wet conditions using nothing but a bow drill and stubbornness. These were skills that no ripperdoc could install and no corpo could sell. Skills that belonged to humanity's oldest operating system, the one that ran on willpower and community and the refusal to give up. V began teaching too. Not combat, though V helped train a watch rotation that could defend the settlement against walkers and hostile strangers alike. V taught planning, organization, how to think 3 steps ahead of a problem instead of reacting to it after it arrived. How to build systems that distributed work and resources fairly so that the settlement would not collapse into the same power struggles that had created the Reapers. At night, sitting around fires that no longer needed to be hidden, V would sometimes look down at the Chrome still visible beneath the skin of both arms. Dead metal now, inert circuits, artifacts from a civilization that felt more distant with every passing day. In Night City, the Chrome had been everything. Identity. Survival itself. But here, in this broken and beautiful world, where the dead walked and the living refused to stop fighting, V had discovered something the Chrome had never been able to provide. Connection. The quiet strength that comes from being needed not for what is installed in your body, but for who you are without it. V left on a morning when the fog sat low over the fields and the settlement was just beginning to stir with the sounds of a new day. There was no dramatic farewell. No speeches. V had never been good at those. Instead, there were quiet words with Elena by the gate, a firm handshake with Marcus, and a long look back at the walls that V had helped build with hands that no longer glowed with circuitry beneath the skin. The road south stretched through empty country that had once been farmland and was now a wild tangle of overgrowth and silence. V carried a pack with clean water, dried food, a hunting knife, and a worn map marked with locations the settlement traders had mentioned in passing. No optics to scan the horizon. No reflex boosters to outrun danger. No monowire coiled and ready to cut through whatever this world threw forward. Just a human being walking through the aftermath of everything, carrying the skills of 2 worlds and the scars of both. Behind V, the settlement grew smaller against the horizon until it disappeared entirely. But what V had left behind would not disappear. The walls would hold. The watch rotations would keep the people safe. The systems V had helped design would keep the community organized and resilient for years to come. And around campfires on quiet nights, the survivors would tell the story of the stranger who appeared from nowhere with glowing eyes and impossible speed and fought beside them when no one else would. They would call V the Chrome Survivor, a ghost from a world of light and machines who walked into their darkness and chose to stay long enough to help them find their way back to something worth living for. The details would change with each telling, the way legends always do. The glowing eyes would become brighter. The speed would become faster. The battle against the Reapers would grow larger and more impossible with every generation that inherited the story. But the truth at the center of the legend would remain unchanged. That survival is not about the technology you carry, or the weapons you wield, or the upgrades installed beneath your skin. Survival is about the choice you make when everything you relied on is stripped away, and you are left standing in the ruins with nothing but your own will and the people beside you. V walked south into a world that was still full of the dead, still full of danger, still full of long roads and uncertain endings. But V walked without fear. Not because the chrome still worked. It did not. Not because the weapons were sharp. They were ordinary. But because somewhere between the neon towers of Night City and the quiet fires of a settlement built from nothing, V had learned the one lesson that mattered. Even in a world of the dead, humanity can still fight for tomorrow. And that was enough.